When human cadet Jake Miller transfers to the prestigious Galactic Military Academy, his alien classmates expect another weak primitive species to torment. What they get instead is a masterclass in human stubbornness, wit, and the kind of creative violence that makes drill sergeants weep with pride. After months of escalating bullying, 10 of the Academy's most arrogant alien cadets corner Jake in combat theory class, expecting an easy victory. Instead, they learn why humans are the galaxy's most feared survivors, one broken nose, twisted tentacle, and bruised ego at a time. My name is SciFi, and I've seen enough stupid decisions in my 3 decades at the Galactic Military Academy to fill a small moon. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for the day they wheeled in a human. The morning started like any other Tuesday in the 7th Sector dormitories. I was lounging on my thermal pad, enjoying the artificial sunlight streaming through the viewport, when the announcement crackled through the Academy's communication system. "All cadets report to Assembly Hall Delta for new student orientation," came the mechanical voice of Administrator Quickstall. "Species Integration Protocol is now in effect." Species Integration Protocol. Those 3 words sent ripples of excitement through the corridors faster than a quantum shockwave. You see, at the Academy we don't get many new species. Most civilizations worth their salt have been part of the Galactic Federation for centuries. When someone new shows up, it usually means one of 2 things. Either we've found another advanced civilization to welcome into our ranks, or some backwater planet finally scraped together enough technology to qualify for military service. I slithered down the corridor, my scales catching the overhead lights as I joined the stream of curious cadets. The usual suspects were there, Korth and his insectoid buddies, their compound eyes gleaming with anticipation, the Volnari twins, their blue skin shimmering as they whispered in their native tongue, and of course Bextor, the Saurian heavyweight who considered himself the unofficial king of our class. "Credits say it's another gasbag species," Korth clicked, his mandibles chattering with amusement. "Remember the last ones? Couldn't even handle standard atmosphere without floating away." "I heard it's something called a human," piped up Nim, one of the smaller crystalline beings. Her voice had that musical quality that made everything sound like a song, even gossip. "From a system called Soul, or something equally ridiculous." "Humans?" Bextor's laugh rumbled through his massive chest. "I looked them up on the database. They're mammals. Mammals, can you believe it? Warm-blooded, soft-skinned, no natural weapons to speak of. They don't even have proper claws or fangs." The assembly hall buzzed with the kind of energy you only get when 300 predatory species gather in one place. We filled the curved seating arrangement, each species naturally clustering together in their little groups. The hierarchy was as clear as crystal. The larger, more physically imposing species commanded respect, while the smaller, more intellectually gifted ones provided support and strategy. It was a system that had worked for millennia. Then the doors hissed open, and in walked the most unremarkable creature I'd ever seen. Jake Miller, though we wouldn't learn his name for another 10 minutes, stood roughly average height by galactic standards. His skin was a pale pinkish tone, covered in some kind of fabric uniform that looked standard issue, but somehow didn't quite fit right. His hair was an unusual brown color, and his eyes, well, his eyes were the most ordinary blue you could imagine. The whispers started immediately. "That's it?" Someone behind me hissed. "That's the new species?" "Look at those tiny teeth," Kolth observed. "What do they eat? Processed nutrients?" "No claws, no armor plating, no defensive spines," Bextor added. "This is going to be entertaining." I watched as Jake stood at attention while Administrator Quickstall delivered the standard welcome speech. The human's posture was decent, I'll give him that. But there was something about the way he kept glancing around the room that screamed easy target. His hands fidgeted with what looked like a small device, and when Quickstall asked him to introduce himself, his voice cracked slightly. Hello," he said, and I swear half the Academy tried not to laugh. "I'm Jake Miller, representing Earth and the human species. I'm looking forward to learning from everyone here." The politeness was almost painful. In a room full of beings who had earned their spots through combat trials, territorial disputes, and survival challenges, Jake's gentle demeanor stuck out like a bright red target painted on his back. After the assembly, I found myself following the crowd of curious onlookers as Jake was escorted to the dormitory assignments. The poor creature looked completely overwhelmed, jumping slightly every time someone's footsteps echoed too loudly in the corridors. "This is going to be fun," Korth whispered to his crew, and they all clicked their agreement. I had to admit, I was curious too. The academy had a well-established social order, and newcomers usually had to fight their way up from the bottom, but Jake looked like he couldn't fight his way out of a paper containment unit, let alone establish himself among some of the galaxy's most competitive military cadets. Oh, how wrong we all were. The harassment began on Jake's second day, and honestly, I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was how methodical Korth's gang became about it. It started small, as these things always do. Jake would sit down for morning nutrition, and somehow his tray would develop a mysterious case of the disappearing act. He'd look around with that confused expression, shrug those narrow shoulders and trudge back to get another serving. The perpetrators would snicker from their tables, compound eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Too easy, Bextor rumbled during one of these early incidents. He doesn't even fight back. And that was the problem, wasn't it? In a military academy where every species had clawed, bitten or battled their way to the top of their respective food chains, Jake's complete lack of aggressive response was unsettling. It went against everything we understood about survival instincts. By week 3, Korth had escalated to what he called educational pranks. Jake's personal belongings would migrate to increasingly creative locations. His uniform ended up in the recycling systems. His study materials found themselves scattered across the zero-gravity training chamber. His sleeping pad was relocated to the ventilation shafts twice. Each time, Jake would simply locate his missing items, clean them off, and continue with his routine. No shouting, no threats, no formal complaints to the instructors. The human would just adapt. "It's like he's broken," Nim observed during one of our tactical study sessions. "Every species has a breaking point. What's his?" That question sparked what became known as the human durability pool. Cadets started placing bets on how long Jake would last before either snapping completely or requesting a transfer back to his primitive little planet. The odds weren't in his favor. Velsek, one of the more intellectually gifted Vulnari, gave him 2 weeks. "Mammals are emotionally unstable," she declared with scientific certainty. "The psychological pressure will overwhelm his primitive nervous system." Thrax, a particularly nasty piece of work from the volcanic systems, bet on Jake lasting a full month, but only because he wanted to see how many different ways a human can cry. I found myself watching Jake more carefully than I care to admit. There was something about his behavior that didn't quite add up. During combat simulations, he'd hang back and observe, taking notes on a small device while others charged ahead with typical aggressive enthusiasm. In tactical planning exercises, he'd ask questions that seemed almost stupid at first, but somehow made the instructors pause and reconsider their answers. "Miller," Professor Grickstahl called out during a weapons familiarity session. "You've been staring at that plasma rifle for 10 minutes. Are you planning to bond with it emotionally?" The class erupted in the usual mix of clicking, hissing and rumbling that passed for laughter among our diverse group. Jake, however, just tilted his head slightly. "I'm trying to understand the energy dispersal pattern, sir. If the containment field fluctuates under stress, wouldn't that affect accuracy in extended combat situations?" Grixinol's expression shifted from amusement to something resembling respect. "That's actually a valid tactical consideration." These moments of unexpected insight became increasingly frequent, and they clearly frustrated Korth's crew. Their victim was supposed to be a simple target, not someone who asked inconvenient questions that made their own ignorance obvious. The escalation was inevitable. During 4th week, Korth's gang moved from petty theft to physical intimidation. Jake would find himself surrounded in corridors, blocked from accessing certain areas, or accidentally bumped hard enough to send him sprawling. Each time witnesses would report the same thing. The human would pick himself up, dust off his uniform, and continue on his way without so much as a harsh word. "He's documenting everything," I overheard Bextor complaining to his cronies. "Every incident, every witness, every timestamp, it's unnatural." And he was right. Jake carried that small device everywhere, and I'd caught glimpses of him making detailed entries after each encounter. The behavior puzzled everyone, including the instructors who were starting to take notice of the species integration challenges. Commander Yuxhal pulled the entire class aside during week 5 for what she euphemistically called a cultural sensitivity briefing. "Some species," she announced, her tentacles writhing with barely contained irritation, "express territorial dominance differently than others. What might seem like acceptable behavior to a Saurian could be interpreted as assault by a more delicate constitution." The way she said delicate constitution while looking directly at Jake made it clear where the administration's sympathies lay. But Jake just sat there, taking more notes, his expression completely neutral. After the briefing, I heard Korth chittering with his gang near the training bays. 2 more weeks, he declared. If the soft skin hasn't broken by then, we make it personal. See how long his documentation helps him when he's in the medical bay. The betting pool adjusted accordingly. Most cadets moved their estimates down to days rather than weeks. But here's what none of us noticed at the time. Jake had stopped looking confused. Those blue eyes of his had developed a calculating quality that should have been our first warning, and that note-taking device, he'd upgraded to a larger model. In retrospect, we should have realized that a species smart enough to achieve interstellar travel might just be smart enough to gather intelligence before taking action. But hindsight, as they say, is always perfectly clear. If there's one thing I've learned about fate, it's that it has a twisted sense of humor. And nowhere was that more obvious than the day Professor Veltash decided to make combat theory class educational. It was week 7 of Jake's stay at the academy, and the tension had reached what you might call a critical mass. Korth's gang was openly discussing their next escalation. The betting pool had reached astronomical numbers, and even the instructors were placing side wagers on when the inevitable explosion would occur. Then Veltash walked into our classroom with that particular expression that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Today, she announced, her forearms spreading wide as she activated the holographic display, we will examine military tactics through the lens of species-specific combat doctrine. Standard stuff, really. We'd covered Saurian siege tactics, insectoid swarm strategies, and Velnari precision strikes in previous sessions. Educational, if somewhat dry. Our case study, Veltash continued, and I swear I saw her glance directly at Jake, will focus on recent human military conflicts. The classroom went dead silent. You could have heard a scale drop. Jake, to his credit, didn't even twitch. He just opened his note-taking device and waited, as if discussing his species' military prowess was the most natural thing in the galaxy. The holographic display flickered to life, showing what appeared to be a muddy, crater-filled landscape dotted with primitive fortifications. Human warfare, Veltash began, is characterized by several unique features: limited physical capabilities, primitive weaponry by galactic standards, and a disturbing tendency toward what they call attrition tactics. Korth's mandibles clicked with barely suppressed amusement. Sounds like they just throw bodies at problems until they go away. An interesting observation, Cadet Korth, Veltash replied. Perhaps our human representative would care to defend his species' military doctrine? The trap was so obvious it practically had warning lights attached to it. Here was Jake, surrounded by 30-some predatory species who had been looking for an excuse to tear him apart for weeks, being asked to justify why humans deserve to exist in a military context. Jake stood up slowly, that infuriating calm never leaving his expression. I'd be happy to discuss human military history, Professor. Excellent, Veltash said, though her tone suggested she found nothing excellent about it. Let's begin with what your species calls World War II. From the historical records, it appears humans spent 6 years essentially trying to exterminate each other. How do you justify such barbaric inefficiency? Dexter leaned forward in his seat, his massive frame creaking with anticipation. Around the room, other cadets began shifting positions, forming what I recognized as hunting patterns. Thrax was flexing his volcanic forged claws. The Velnari twins had gone perfectly still, which in their species meant they were preparing to strike. Well, Jake said, and I noticed his voice had lost that slight tremor it carried during his first weeks here. I suppose it depends on how you define efficiency. Efficiency, Nim chimed in, her crystalline voice dripping with condescension, is achieving maximum tactical objectives with minimum resource expenditure, something your species clearly never learned. Agreed, rumbled Velsik. Humans required external assistance to defeat their enemies. They couldn't even handle their own planetary conflicts without forming alliances. More cadets joined the verbal assault. Zextal criticized human weapons technology. Morduk questioned their strategic planning capabilities. Gaxhai openly mocked their physical limitations. Through it all, Jake stood there taking notes and nodding as if he were attending a pleasant academic lecture rather than being systematically torn apart by hostile aliens. So, Korth finally said, rising from his seat with deliberate menace, What you're telling us is that humans are weak, technologically inferior, and incapable of independent military action? The classroom had gone beyond tense. It was predatory. 10 different species, representing some of the galaxy's most aggressive military traditions, had united in their assessment of human inadequacy. The air itself seemed to vibrate with barely contained violence. Jake looked around the room, meeting each hostile gaze with that same infuriating calm. "That's one interpretation," he said quietly. And then, for the first time since arriving at the academy, Jake Miller smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Now I've witnessed my fair share of fights during my time at the academy, territorial disputes, mating challenges, the occasional philosophical disagreement that turned violent, standard fare for a military institution filled with apex predators from across the galaxy. But what happened next redefined my understanding of the phrase educational experience. Korth made the first move, naturally. Insectoids are all about establishing dominance through direct confrontation, and his compound eyes were practically glowing with anticipated victory. He launched himself across 3 desk rows with that impressive chitinous grace his species was known for, razor-sharp mandibles extended and ready to deliver what should have been a fight-ending strike. Here's what everyone expected. Jake would freeze up, maybe throw his hands up defensively, probably scream like the soft-skinned mammal we all assumed he was, and then spend the next few weeks in the medical bay learning about the Academy's natural selection process. Here's what actually happened. Jake shifted exactly 1 step to the left. Korth sailed past him like a guided missile that had lost its target lock, crashed into Professor Veltash's desk with a sound like breaking ceramic, and created an impromptu sculpture out of holographic projectors and his own dignity. "Ah," Jake observed mildly, as if Korth had simply asked him a question about homework. "Interesting attack pattern." The classroom erupted into motion. Nim, the crystalline being who'd been so vocal about human inadequacy, decided to demonstrate proper technique. Her species was known for their precision strikes. Those mineral-hard fists could punch through standard armor plating, and their razor-sharp edges had ended more than one diplomatic negotiation. She glided forward with that eerie musical movement that made crystalline beings such effective assassins, her arm extending toward Jake's center mass in a strike that should have opened him up like a badly packaged shipping container. Jake caught her wrist. Not blocked, not deflected, caught with his bare hand. The sound that came from Nim wasn't musical anymore. It was the distinctly unpleasant noise of someone discovering that their supposedly invincible attack had met an immovable object. Jake twisted, not violently, just a simple rotation that used Nim's own momentum against her, and suddenly the galaxy's most precise striker was performing an impromptu interpretive dance on the floor. "Leverage," Jake explained to no one in particular, still holding Nim's wrist in what appeared to be a completely relaxed grip. "It's amazing what you can accomplish when you understand basic physics." That's when I realized we had completely misjudged this creature. See, every species in the galaxy had developed their combat techniques around their natural advantages. Saurians relied on mass and armor, insectoids used speed and cutting implements. Crystalline beings counted on precision and hardness. We'd all evolved to be bigger, faster, stronger, or deadlier than our competition. Humans apparently had evolved to be smarter. Bextor decided to introduce Jake to the concept of overwhelming force. All 400 pounds of scaled muscle launched itself across the classroom with the subtlety of a falling meteor. His strategy was simple. Whatever mysterious technique the human was using wouldn't matter when faced with pure, unstoppable mass. Jake dropped Nim's wrist and took 2 quick steps backward, pulling one of the standard-issue chairs into position between himself and the incoming Saurian missile. Physics, as it turns out, is remarkably impartial. Bextor hit the chair at full velocity, discovered that momentum is conserved regardless of species, and learned that classroom furniture makes an excellent fulcrum when properly applied. He launched himself into a beautiful arc that ended with him upside down against the far wall, wondering how a simple charge had turned into an unscheduled flying lesson. "Momentum conservation," Jake noted, brushing dust off his uniform. "They really should cover this in basic tactical training." By this point, the remaining 7 attackers were starting to look less confident and more confused. Their easy victim had just dismantled 3 of their strongest fighters using nothing but basic physics and what appeared to be an advanced degree in making other people look stupid. Thrax, bless his volcanic heart, decided to try a different approach. His species specialized in environmental adaptation. Those claws of his could tear through most known materials, and his heat resistance made him practically immune to energy weapons. Surely a soft, temperature-sensitive mammal would crumble before superior Thraxian engineering. He advanced more carefully than the others, claws extended, looking for an opening that would let him demonstrate proper dismemberment technique. Jake waited until Thrax was within striking distance, then did something that violated every combat principle I'd ever learned. He stepped forward, inside Thrax's reach, and somehow ended up behind him. The speed wasn't superhuman. The technique wasn't exotic. Jake had simply moved in a way that Thrax's combat programming hadn't accounted for. While Thrax was still figuring out where his target had gone, Jake placed one hand on the Thraxian's shoulder and applied what appeared to be gentle pressure. Thrax dropped like his personal gravity had suddenly tripled. "Pressure points," Jake said conversationally, as Thrax tried to remember how to make his legs work. Funny how every species has them, but nobody thinks to defend them. The remaining 6 attackers were now clustered together, staring at Jake with expressions that ranged from confused to terrified. Their invincible predator had just demonstrated that he knew more about their anatomies than they did. "You know," Jake continued, rolling his shoulders like he was warming up for a proper workout, 7 weeks of taking notes on galactic species really does pay off. Amazing what you can learn when you actually pay attention. That's when I realized what Jake's note-taking device had really been recording. Not complaints for the administration, not documentation of harassment. Combat data. 7 weeks of careful observation, recording attack patterns, noting physical capabilities and limitations, studying how each species moved, fought, and thought. The humans hadn't sent the Academy a victim. They'd sent a researcher. What happened next can only be described as a masterclass in applied xenobiology, with a minor in creative violence and a doctorate in making apex predators question their life choices. The remaining 6 attackers had finally realized they weren't dealing with a typical victim, but by then it was far too late to reconsider their tactical approach. Jake stood in the center of the classroom, completely relaxed, like a professor about to deliver a lecture on the fundamental inadequacies of galactic military doctrine. Velsec and her twin sister Morsec decided to demonstrate Velnari pack hunting techniques. Their species coordinated through bioluminescent communication. Those blue skin patterns that flickered in complex sequences allowed them to execute synchronized attacks that had taken down creatures 10 times their size. Unfortunately for them, Jake had been watching those pretty light shows for 7 weeks. The twins split apart, moving in their traditional pincer formation, skin patterns pulsing in perfect harmony as they communicated their attack strategy. Left flank, right flank, simultaneous strike to overwhelm the target's defensive capabilities. Jake glanced at Velsec's light pattern, then at Morisec's, and nodded thoughtfully. "You know," he said, reaching behind him to grab Professor Veltash's emergency illumination device, "bioluminescent communication is fascinating, especially when you figure out the frequency." He triggered the device. The emergency illuminator strobed directly at the same frequency as Velnari coordination signals, flooding the room with chaotic blue light that turned their sophisticated communication system into the equivalent of 2 musicians trying to play different songs simultaneously while someone screamed into their ears. The twins stumbled into each other like they were drunk, their coordination completely scrambled. Jake stepped aside as they collapsed in a tangle of confused limbs and misfiring light patterns. "Frequency interference," he observed, switching off the illuminator. "Really should have been covered in your communications security training." Zixtalion, apparently deciding that subtlety was overrated, chose this moment to demonstrate why his species had dominated the heavy combat divisions for 3 centuries. Zixtalions were living tanks, thick armor plating, redundant organ systems, and enough raw strength to punch through starship hulls. They didn't bother with fancy techniques because they didn't need them. He charged forward with the unstoppable momentum of a geological event, confident that whatever tricks the human had used on the others wouldn't work against pure overwhelming force. Jake picked up a standard academy chair. "Now, let me explain something about furniture design in multi-species environments. Academy chairs are built to accommodate everything from my flexible reptilian frame to Bextor's massive bulk. They're also designed to survive the casual abuse of creatures who could accidentally demolish buildings. The structural engineering involved makes them surprisingly versatile tools." Jake swung the chair in a perfect arc, timing it so that Zyxdol's charge carried him directly into the impact. The sound was like a ship's hull meeting an asteroid. Zyxdol's impressive momentum suddenly had nowhere to go except backwards, carrying him in a spectacular tumble that ended with him wedged upside down in the ventilation shaft. Kinetic energy transfer, Jake explained to the shaft, though I doubt Zyxdol was in any condition to appreciate the physics lesson. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. HFY, one of the more intelligent attackers, had been hanging back and analyzing Jake's techniques. His species were natural strategists. They'd observe, adapt, and counterattack, using whatever method proved most effective. Surely careful observation would reveal the human's weakness. Jake noticed the analysis immediately. "Trying to figure out my pattern?" he asked conversationally. "That's smart. Your species evolved from pursuit predators, right? Patient observation, adaptive tactics, wearing down the target through superior planning." HFY's eyes narrowed. How did the human know their evolutionary background? "The problem," Jake continued, moving toward the classroom supply cabinet, "is that you're assuming I have a pattern." He opened the cabinet and began pulling out random items: training weights, holographic projectors, a molecular scanner, 3 different types of measurement tools, and what appeared to be someone's forgotten lunch container. "See, my species didn't evolve for specific combat roles," Jake explained, juggling the disparate objects with surprising dexterity. "We evolved for problem-solving, which means every situation gets a custom solution." He threw the lunch container. HFY, expecting some kind of sophisticated tactical maneuver, prepared to counter what was obviously a distraction technique. The container bounced harmlessly off his chest, confirming his assessment that humans were indeed primitive creatures who resorted to throwing food when proper tactics failed. While HFY was busy feeling superior about his tactical analysis, Jake lobbed the molecular scanner in a gentle arc. HFY ignored it, clearly another desperate distraction. The scanner landed behind him and immediately began its standard activation sequence, which included a rather impressive energy discharge that, while harmless to most equipment, produced exactly the right frequency to overwhelm HFY's sensitive nervous system. He collapsed like someone had just unplugged his brain. "Improvisation," Jake noted, retrieving the scanner. "It's amazing what you can accomplish when you actually read the equipment manuals." That left 2 attackers: Hexerin, whose species were renowned for their toxic secretions, and Kekmore, whose people had perfected the art of phase shifting through solid matter. They advanced together, confident that their exotic abilities would finally prove too much for the human's bag of tricks. Hexerin began oozing that lovely green substance that could dissolve most known materials, while Kekmore started flickering in and out of phase, preparing to materialize inside Jake's personal space. Jake looked at them both, sighed, and picked up Professor Veltash's thermos. "You know what the problem is with exotic abilities?" he asked, opening the thermos and releasing a cloud of steam. "Everyone assumes they're unbeatable because they're unusual." The steam filled the immediate area, and suddenly Kekmore's phase shifting became less mysterious alien ability and more stumbling around blindly. Meanwhile, Hexerin discovered that his toxic secretions had an unfortunate reaction to rapid temperature changes, causing them to crystallize and coat his own body in a layer of hardened poison. Jake walked through the steam cloud like he owned it, gently guided the disoriented Kekmore into a collision with the self-crystallized Hexerin, and stepped back to admire his handiwork. "Environmental manipulation," he explained to the room in general. "Sometimes the best weapon is just changing the rules." 10 attackers, 10 different species, 10 unique sets of natural advantages that had served them well throughout their evolutionary history. 10 aliens now decorating the classroom floor in various states of bewilderment, embarrassment, and physical discomfort. And 1 human standing calmly in the center of it all, brushing dust off his uniform like he'd just finished a particularly engaging homework assignment. "You know," Jake said, looking around at the carnage with apparent satisfaction, "I really should thank you all. This has been incredibly educational." The worst part? He actually seemed grateful. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet you only get when reality has just performed an unscheduled maintenance check on everyone's assumptions. 10 of the Academy's most formidable predators were scattered across the classroom floor like discarded training equipment, while 1 supposedly primitive mammal stood among them, looking like he'd just completed a routine exercise. That's when the doors burst open. Professor Veltash stormed in first, followed by Security Chief Mortak, and half the Academy's emergency response team. They'd clearly expected to find Jake in several pieces, possibly with educational diagrams explaining which parts went where. Instead, they found what appeared to be the aftermath of a natural disaster, if natural disasters were capable of precise tactical planning and had a doctorate in applied physics. What in the name of the 7 spiral arms happened here? Veltash demanded, her 4 eyes taking in the scene with the kind of expression you get when your worldview has just been fed through a quantum shredder. Jake, who had somehow managed to locate his chair among the wreckage and was now sitting calmly at his desk with his note-taking device open, looked up with that same mild expression he'd worn throughout his entire stay at the Academy. "Self-defense, Professor," he said simply. "They attacked. I defended myself." Security Chief Moratak, whose species had evolved from apex predators that could track prey across 3 star systems, surveyed the classroom with professional assessment. His gaze lingered on each fallen cadet, noting the precise nature of their defeats, the complete lack of permanent damage, and the fact that Jake didn't have so much as a wrinkled uniform. 10 attackers, Moratak observed, his voice carrying the kind of respect usually reserved for natural phenomena. Simultaneous assault. 0 injuries to the defender. "Well," Jake corrected politely, "technically it wasn't simultaneous. They came at me in waves, which really simplified the tactical considerations." Veltash activated her emergency medical scanner and began checking the fallen cadets. Court was conscious but confused, still trying to figure out how his precision strike had turned into an impromptu meeting with furniture. Nim was sitting up, staring at her hands like they'd betrayed her. Bextor was attempting to extract himself from the wall with what remained of his dignity. "Professor," Jake said, consulting his device, "I should mention that I've documented every instance of harassment, intimidation, and assault over the past 7 weeks. Complete records, including timestamps, witnesses, and behavioral analyses. Would you like me to transfer the files to Academy administration?" The expressions around the room shifted from confusion to something approaching dread. Veltash's skin patterns flickered through colors I'd never seen before, while Mortak's professional demeanor took on a distinctly grim quality. "You documented everything?" Veltash asked weakly. "Oh yes," Jake replied, and for the first time since I'd known him, his smile looked genuinely cheerful. "My species has a saying, trust but verify. I've been verifying for quite some time now." The investigation that followed was swift, thorough, and absolutely devastating for everyone involved except Jake. 7 weeks of carefully documented harassment, complete with video evidence, witness statements, and detailed psychological profiles of the perpetrators. Jake had built a legal case that could have convicted them of war crimes in 14 different star systems. Korth and his gang found themselves facing formal disciplinary hearings, suspension from combat training, and the kind of permanent academic records that would follow them to whatever career graveyard awaited disgraced military cadets. Meanwhile, Jake received a formal commendation for exemplary defensive tactics under extreme duress, and was offered advanced placement in several tactical planning courses. But here's what really got to me, sitting there watching this whole affair unfold. The complete reversal of everything we thought we knew about humans. For 7 weeks we'd seen Jake as a victim. Weak, primitive, unsuited for military service. A creature to be pitied at best, eliminated at worst. We'd made the classic predator mistake of assuming that visible weakness meant actual weakness. We'd forgotten that humans had fought their way off a death world, built an interstellar civilization, and earned their place in the Galactic Federation not through superior physical capabilities, but through something far more dangerous, superior tactical thinking. They'd sent us exactly what we expected to see, a harmless, unremarkable specimen who wouldn't threaten our established hierarchy, and while we were busy congratulating ourselves on our superior predatory instincts, that harmless specimen had systematically analyzed our weaknesses, documented our behavioral patterns, and prepared countermeasures for every possible threat. "You know," Jake said, as the security team finished processing the scene, and the medical team carted off the last of his attackers, "I really did learn a lot about galactic military doctrine. Very educational experience." He packed up his note-taking device and headed for the door, pausing only to address Professor Veltash. "Oh, and Professor, you might want to revise that lecture about human military inefficiency. We actually won both of those wars." As he walked out, I heard him add, almost as an afterthought, "We just prefer to let our enemies underestimate us first. Makes the tactical planning so much simpler." The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving the rest of us to contemplate the uncomfortable realization that we'd just witnessed a perfect demonstration of human military doctrine in action. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a disturbing thought began to form. If this was what humans sent to military academy, what exactly were they keeping back home for actual warfare? I decided I really didn't want to know the answer to that question. 3 months later, the Galactic Military Academy issued new guidelines for species integration protocols. Funny how quickly institutional policy can change when faced with the uncomfortable reality that your educational philosophy has been fundamentally wrong for several centuries. Jake Miller became something of a legend around the academy, though not in the way anyone had originally expected. Cadets would point him out in the corridors with the kind of respectful distance usually reserved for unexploded ordnance or particularly dangerous weather phenomena. "There goes the human," they'd whisper, and it was no longer said with mockery. The betting pool, incidentally, was declared null and void after Security Chief Mortark determined that Jake had technically won by default. The credits were donated to the Academy's new Cultural Sensitivity Training program, which mostly consisted of lectures about not assuming physical appearance correlates with combat effectiveness. Jake, for his part, integrated into Academy life with the same methodical efficiency he demonstrated during the classroom incident. His tactical planning courses became legendary among the faculty, not because he displayed any superhuman abilities, but because he had this annoying habit of finding solutions that nobody else had considered. During a simulated siege exercise, while other species relied on their natural advantages, saurian armor, insectoid speed, Velnari precision, Jake won by convincing the opposing force that his team had already surrendered, then capturing their command center while they were busy celebrating. "Psychological warfare," he explained to the bewildered instructors. "Sometimes the best weapon is making your enemy think they've already won." I found myself watching him differently now. Where I'd once seen weakness and primitive simplicity, I now recognized careful observation and tactical patience. Those awkward first-day fumbles hadn't been incompetence, they'd been reconnaissance. The really disturbing part was realizing how thoroughly we'd been played. Every species in the galaxy had made the same mistake. We'd looked at humans and seen soft skin, small teeth, limited physical capabilities, and assumed we understood their threat level. We'd completely missed the fact that they'd turned thinking into a weapon. 6 months after the classroom incident, I received word that 3 more human cadets were being transferred to the academy. The announcement was met with respectful attention rather than anticipatory mockery, and I noticed several cadets quietly reviewing their species' anatomical weak points. Jake had fundamentally altered how the academy viewed humanity, but more importantly, he'd changed how we viewed ourselves. It's humbling to realize that your entire civilization's military doctrine might be based on the flawed assumption that bigger, stronger, and faster automatically equals superior. The day before graduation, I found Jake in the observation deck, looking out at the stars with that same mild expression he'd worn since his arrival. "Any regrets about coming here?" I asked. He considered the question with typical human thoughtfulness. "Not really," he said finally. "It was exactly the educational experience I was hoping for." "And what did you learn?" Jake smiled that not quite pleasant smile. "I'd learned to associate with impending tactical demonstrations. That the galaxy's military academies teach species to fight using their natural advantages," he said, "which means they also teach them to expect everyone else to do the same thing." He gathered his materials and headed toward the graduation ceremony, pausing only to add, "The next human class should have a much easier time adjusting." As I watched him walk away, I realized that Jake Miller hadn't just survived the Academy's traditional hierarchy. He'd rewritten it entirely. And somewhere in the depths of space, humanity was probably very quietly taking notes on everything we'd just taught them about galactic military thinking. The truly terrifying part? We'd done it completely voluntarily.